Hello, and welcome to Force's July Hereditary Cancer Live Update. Our live updates are meant to deliver news designed to keep you informed, empowered, and engaged. The updates given today are paramount to our community. My name is Verinda Hobbs. I am the Partnership Strategy Manager and a member of the Force community, and I will be your moderator. Force unites and advocates for people across many different mutations and cancer types. Our staff, volunteers, and constituents empower each other to ensure that all who are facing a challenging situation can be well-informed and courageous. Force wants you to know that you are not alone and that you have a community where you belong. We accomplish the Force mission through our support, advocacy, education, and resource efforts. Visit our website for expert-reviewed information and access to our support programs, including virtual Zoom meetings, our peer navigation matching program, and our online message boards. At this time, we'd like to recognize our sponsors for making this programming possible and for their continued support of Force and the hereditary cancer community. For today's session, the chat is disabled. Here are our speakers for today's discussion. After all the updates are completed, we will conduct a Q&A to answer any questions you may have. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature on your Zoom toolbar, which will be located at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your view. We will do our best to get to as many of your questions as we can at the end of the updates. Our presenters will not be providing medical advice. Please reach out to your doctor if you have any specific or urgent questions. At this time, I would like to welcome Lisa Schlager, Vice President of Public Policy.
Thank you, Verinda, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to provide an update on some of our public policy efforts. So we'd like to start with some of our federal legislation. Specifically, we have 3 pieces of legislation highlighted here on the slide. These are crucial pieces of legislation for our community as far as access to care. The Reducing Hereditary Cancer Act is a bill that would enable Medicare to cover genetic counseling and testing for people who do not have cancer. Currently, Medicare policy stipulates that you must be diagnosed or have a suspected diagnosis of cancer in order to undergo genetic testing. We believe this is short-sighted and doesn't facilitate prevention and early detection. So we're working to encourage Congress to pass a law that requires Medicare to cover genetic counseling and testing. And then for those who do test positive for a known mutation, it would also cover all of the downstream recommended screening and preventive services. Along with that is the Access to Genetic Counselor Services Act. Like the Reducing Hereditary Cancer Act, this also focuses on Medicare coverage. Unfortunately, genetic counselors are not currently approved providers under the Medicare system. They must work under a different medical doctor or another healthcare provider in order to get reimbursed for their services. And we know that this can create access barriers. So we are supporting the Access to Genetic Counselor Services Act to ensure that genetic counselors can be reimbursed for their counseling services, regardless of who they work with around the country. And we think this will facilitate broader uptake and increased access to genetic counseling services. And finally, the Access to Breast Cancer Diagnosis Act, also known as the ABCD Act. This legislation would create a federal law that will cover supplemental and diagnostic breast imaging at zero out-of-pocket cost to the patient. So that means things like breast MRIs, breast ultrasounds, whether it's for screening or diagnosing breast cancer, would be covered with zero cost to the patient by most health plans. We think these are very important pieces of legislation, and we hope you will support us in advocating for their passage. Next slide. Another piece of legislation I want to call your attention to is called the Patent Eligibility Restoration Act, or PARA. We've talked about this previously, but it recently, there was a hearing in the Senate, and so it is gaining attention again. And we want to help you understand why it's so important that this new law not pass. Unfortunately, the law as written would eliminate all prior Supreme Court precedents and other court precedents, meaning cases like the 2013 Supreme Court ruling that human genes cannot be patented will in fact be wiped out or eliminated from the record. And the new law would in fact permit patenting of DNA if it is purified or a machine is used to evaluate it. Well, we know that, in fact, DNA must be purified or evaluated with machines. So therefore, it would allow for patenting of human biomarkers or genetic mutations. And we have strong concerns about this because it can lead to higher costs and testing monopolies. So we don't want to go back to the pre-2013 Supreme Court ruling. So we're hoping you'll join us in opposing this legislation. Next slide. And this is how you can help. If you scan this QR code or go to the web address here at the top, facingourrisk.org, take action, you will find pre-written customizable emails that you can send to your federal lawmakers. All you have to do is enter your address and it will identify your members of Congress and Senate. And you can go ahead and reach out and ask them to either support or to oppose those pieces of legislation that I just described. And if you are interested in getting more engaged, you can explore volunteering as a patient advocate leader. And that link is at the bottom of this slide. Thank you. Next slide. Turning our attention to state advocacy, FORCE is very active in state legislative efforts around the US. Many state legislative sessions have closed, but these are some of the successes that we've had already this year. You can see we've already helped pass 8 new state laws, and they fall into 4 categories, including high-risk breast and prostate screenings, genetic counselor licensure, and access to fertility services. There are still a number of state sessions that are in progress, and those are listed at the bottom here. If you want to see what's going on in those states, the QR code in the bottom right of this slide can be scanned, or the web address is at the top under the title. And you can see where there are still activities taking place and what they involve. And if you have any questions about those legislative efforts or are interested in getting engaged, just let us know. Next slide. All right, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, I guess back to Verinda, and she will introduce, actually, Diane Rose is next, I believe.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. Next, I'd like to welcome Diane Rose, Vice President of Research.
Thank you, Verinda. You want to go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So today I'm going to talk about some hereditary cancer research updates. A major focus of our work is making sure that people know about clinical trials and that they feel informed and supported to participate in research that can directly benefit them or their family members and our FORCE community. FORCE's Search and Enroll tool is a user-friendly platform that provides plain language descriptions, what the study is asking, who qualifies, and exactly how someone can enroll in this study. And our goal is to bridge the gap between interest and enrollment and to make research accessible to people who are navigating inherited cancer risk. Next slide, please. We know that people in our community are at high risk for pancreatic cancer and that they face many barriers to imaging, surveillance, and screening, including time constraints, financial barriers, and limited access to surveillance or screening centers. And so many of you may remember that FORCE and the research team at Immunovia recently collaborated on a survey to understand knowledge and opinions about pancreatic cancer screening, access to, and decision-making around the screening, and how a blood-based test might influence screening among people with inherited mutations that are associated with pancreatic cancer risk, including APC, ATM, BRCA1, BRCA2, CDKN2A, EpCAM, the Lynch syndrome genes, and STK11 and TP53. Next slide, please. And the question that we wanted to answer is whether the availability of a blood-based test addresses these barriers that people experience and whether that would improve surveillance uptake among high-risk individuals. Next slide, please. So we recruited 392 people, all of you possibly on the call who attended, from the FORCE community who were ages 45 years old and older with a genetic or a family risk of pancreatic cancer, and you completed the multiple choice survey. Many of you, 303 of you actually, also responded to the open-ended questions, and we thank you so much for your participation. Next slide, please. So here are some preliminary results from the survey, and we'll share more in-depth information in the near future when we've had time to really dig into all of the data that was collected. So the multiple choice answers provided a lot of information, and the open-ended questions also gave more insight into the specific barriers. On this chart, you can see that the cost of screening is the most frequently reported barrier. Anxiety about the test results is the next highest barrier, followed by scheduling, transportation, insurance, and then privacy concerns. People also reported in those open-ended questions that claustrophobia during the MRI and anesthesia and fasting were also barriers to getting the appropriate screening. And then there were also provider and system level barriers that were reported to us, and that included a lack of provider awareness about the screening that's needed for people at high risk of pancreatic cancer, and then conflicting clinical recommendations. Next slide, please. And so here on this chart, we have people's responses to the survey. And in the first column, we see that for those people who are currently participating in regular pancreatic cancer screening, they indicated that they view a blood-based test as an enhancement to their existing surveillance and screening. For those people who had some pancreatic cancer screening but no longer participate regularly, this is the middle column, they view a blood-based test as a tool to make surveillance more feasible. 24.2% cited that a lower cost would be helpful, and 18.2% cited that early detection were the reasons that they chose this answer on the survey. And then for people who have not had any pancreatic screening, they view a blood-based test as a tool to begin surveillance. 25% citing that it's not as invasive as the other options of the MRI and endoscopies, and 18.5% cited early detection. Next slide, please. And so the conclusions of the study that we have so far is that a blood-based test could make routine screening more accessible and affordable for people who are not adherent or who had not had any prior screening or participation in screening. And a blood-based test could also provide an entry point to screening if accompanied by provider education and engagement. So, really positive feedback and information. Next slide, please. I just want to go through a couple studies that are enrolling, and these are listed on our website. There's a QR code here on the screen. And these are some more studies focused around pancreatic cancer research. This first study is the PRECEDE study, and it's collecting clinical information, family history, and samples, which would be blood, saliva, or a cheek swab, from people and families who are at risk for pancreatic cancer. And the goal of the study is to collect this information and the samples, and it will create a resource to drive research that's necessary for early detection and prevention of pancreatic cancer. And this study is currently enrolling in 19 states and internationally. Next slide, please. This study is for a vaccine for people at high risk for pancreatic cancer, and it's testing an experimental vaccine that helps the immune system recognize changes in a protein called KRAS, which is commonly involved in pancreatic cancer. And this vaccine is given with an immune boosting medication that helps improve the body's response. So the main goals of this study are to see whether the vaccine is safe and whether it triggers an immune response that could help protect against pancreatic cancer. And the next slide, please. And this study is Resolute 303, and it's looking at a new targeted therapy for first-line treatment for people with metastatic prostate cancer. This is the same targeted therapy that we did a recent X-ray review on, and Piri will be highlighting that in the next section of our talk today. And the last slide, please. So the studies that I just discussed, and along with many other studies, reflect the breadth of research that's needed for the hereditary cancer community, from new treatments to new prevention strategies. And our community really stands to benefit directly from these answers that these trials are going to generate. So through Search and Enroll, FORCE helps people find studies more quickly, understand them in plain language, and really feel supported in making decisions about participation. So I encourage you to explore the tool and share it with your family members and with others and with your healthcare providers. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. And finally, I would like to welcome Piri Welsh, Vice President of Education.
Thanks, Verinda. I'm going to talk about 3 recent X-ray reviews. The first one is hereditary cancer focused. The next 2 I thought the community would just be interested in. They're not particularly hereditary cancer. So the first review I'm going to talk about is breast cancer risk after ovarian cancer. So as probably most people on this call know, women who have an inherited mutation in BRCA1 or 2 have a higher lifetime risk of developing breast, ovarian, and other cancers compared to women without these mutations. And current guidelines do outline risk reduction and preventative strategies for breast and ovarian cancer for women who have a BRCA mutation. However, current guidelines don't provide specific details or guidance for high-risk women who previously have had ovarian cancer. So that's what this study wanted to look at. What is the risk of breast cancer after a previous ovarian cancer diagnosis in women with BRCA1 and 2 mutations? And this study found that women who have had ovarian cancer have a relatively low risk of developing breast cancer after ovarian cancer. And they use some statistical analyses to estimate the risks. So after 5 years of follow-up, the lifetime risk of breast cancer for these women was about 4.5%. At 10 years is about 9%. And at 15 years, it was just over 11%, which is a bit lower than the lifetime risk for breast cancer for the general population. So the researchers are hoping to help develop or provide data for guidelines for women who have had ovarian cancer, who have a BRCA1 or 2 mutation, who are concerned about their breast cancer risk. The second X-ray review made a huge splash at ASCO, and you may have heard or read about this in the news. There is a new targeted treatment, and as Diane mentioned, a lot of pancreatic cancers have mutations in the RAS gene. And this drug, daraxonrasib, targets the RAS gene mutations that are in pancreatic cancer. And it's a pill, so it's not a IV administered drug. And what they found was pretty astonishing. Participants in the trial who were taking daraxonrasib had about 3.5 months of overall survival compared to just under 7 months for people who just had chemotherapy. So this drug basically doubled overall survival. And similarly, it doubled progression-free survival or until the time until cancer came back, which on the drug was just over 7 months, and people who were just on chemotherapy about 3.5 months. This drug is now available under the FDA's protocol for expanded access, and the drug is available for people with metastatic pancreatic cancer or pancreatic cancer that has been treated and continues to progress. The way to get this drug is outlined in this X-ray review, but basically your oncologist has to request access by the manufacturer, the company that makes the drug, and then a decision will be made as to whether or not you can get access to the drug. So you don't have to be in a clinical trial at the moment. The last X-ray review is on an interesting study that looked at music therapy to release and reduce anxiety in cancer survivors generally. And music therapy is a type of therapy that is different than traditional talk therapy. And music therapists may, encourage their patients to listen to their favorite type of music, country music, or a favorite artist. And basically what this does in the brain is slow breathing, release tension, and basically shift your anxiety away from all those racing thoughts that you may be having. And the study found that either talk therapy, cognitive therapy, or music therapy not only led to improvements in anxiety levels, but also in sleep, fatigue, and overall quality of life. And that QR code that's next to the X-ray review is a link to an organization of certified board music therapists. And they have a nice find a therapist tool that you can search by location, country. If you know the name of a certain music therapist, you can search by name. So that's a resource I thought some people might be interested in. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Perry. Thank you to our 4 speakers. We'll now begin the Q&A portion of our update. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature on the Zoom toolbar, which is located at the top or bottom of your screen. And we will do our best to answer each one and get to as many of these questions as we can. So the first question I have looks like it goes to Lisa. Lisa, the question is, you shared information about the Access to Breast Cancer Diagnosis Act, but I've heard the Find It Early Act is a better piece of legislation. Can you speak to this? And then second part of that question is, how are the bills different?
Great question, and thank you for the inquiry. There are two pieces of legislation, federal legislation right now, that aim to address the out-of-pocket costs for supplemental and diagnostic breast imaging. And both of them really aim to achieve the same thing, which is to eliminate the patient's out-of-pocket costs for doing the right thing, which is getting their screenings and getting to the point where they're either determining that there is no breast cancer or that there is. It's all part of the screening journey. Both bills are trying to address that. The difference is that the ABCD Act is a little more limited in scope. Right now, that bill focuses on group health insurance and high deductible plans, versus the Find It Early Act also includes programs such as ERISA insurance plans and some of the government-sponsored health plans like Medicare, Medicaid. Ultimately, we would definitely like to see everyone have broader access with limited to no costs out of pocket. However, in this current environment, where we're trying to focus on out-of-pocket costs, not only for the patient, but also for the government, and to keep healthcare costs down. We feel that it's got a better chance of passing via the ABCD Act, just because the bottom line, the cost of that legislation is going to be less expensive to that government. Long term, we would absolutely like to see that expanded. But currently, with the concerns around budget constraints and the deficit, we think the ABCD Act has a better chance of passing. So otherwise, I think those bills are relatively similar.
Thank you, Lisa. Actually, I have another question for you. Two of the federal bills you mentioned focus on Medicare coverage. I'm not on Medicare, so those issues don't affect me, right?
They do, actually. So even if you're not a Medicare beneficiary, you're not 65 yet, or you're not on Medicare for some other reason, Medicare sets an example for the rest of the insurers. So even your employer's Blue Cross Blue Shield plan or Aetna or Cigna, they all look to Medicare to see what Medicare is doing. And a lot of times there's what we call a trickle-down effect. So even if you're 35 and you're on your employer's health plan, you may not think that Medicare policy has much to do with you, but in fact, it does affect what your insurance company may do. And it also affects your relatives. It'll affect you one day when you reach Medicare age. So there are a lot of reasons to be concerned about what Medicare covers. And I encourage people, even if they're not currently Medicare beneficiaries, to think about it through a bigger lens about access to care for your parents, your grandparents, or for you someday, but also, the policies that may impact what your existing insurer actually covers. So that's why we want to see Medicare have policies that are friendly to the hereditary cancer community.
That's great. Thank you. Diane, looks like I have a question for you. How do I know if I'm eligible for pancreatic cancer screening or one of these research studies?
Thank you. That's a great question. So eligibility is going to depend on a few different factors, and that includes your personal history, health history, your family health history, whether you've been diagnosed with a cancer or you're a previvor, and whether you carry, any inherited mutation. So the best place to start is by talking with your healthcare team or a genetic counselor, and then you can use the Forces Search and Enroll tool to explore studies based on your specific situation. Within the tool, we have different search features. So you can put in your mutation, you can put in the certain cancer that you're looking for screening or treatment for, and any other factors. You can search by location, and you can put all of that in there, and it'll bring up a very specific results for you. And then you can read through those. The eligibility is all listed in the study, within the study on the Force webpage, very clear. There's a green checkbox for eligibility and a red X for ineligible.
Thank you. And there's one more, Diane. Looks like the vaccine studies sound exciting. Are these vaccines meant to prevent pancreatic cancer or treat people who already have cancer?
Great question. So again, that depends on the study. The pancreatic cancer prevention vaccine study is designed for people at high risk, but who have not been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And then, and some of the other studies are for treatment. It depends on the situation, but again, you can look through the search and enroll tool and look at the study summary, which will tell you, if it's a prevention study, if it's a treatment study, and read through the eligibility criteria.
Thank you. Piri, there's a question here. How does music therapy differ from traditional cognitive therapy?
I was hoping someone would ask this question. So traditional cognitive therapy, or what people might think of as talk therapy, a therapist would work with you to go through, certain thoughts or feelings that you're having. So, for example, if someone is overwhelmed with work, they may not be able to get, they feel like they're going to fail. That thought is, running around in their mind, and cognitive therapists may help their patient replace that anxiety-inducing thought with a more balanced thought. So, for example, I can handle one task at work at a time. Music therapy really allows patients and therapists to basically develop a playlist that helps them, reduce anxiety, stress, and also, get rid of those thoughts, but in a different way. The one thing about music therapy that differs from cognitive therapy is that music therapy can be more passive. You can have your music therapy playlist and be listening to it in the car as you're going to work or before you go to bed. So you don't have to be in a therapist's office to experience music therapy. And I'll just end with, when I say "Here Comes the Sun" by the Beatles, and you think about that song, what kind of mood does that put you in? So that's kind of the underlying mechanism for music therapy.
Thanks, Piri. A question just came in. I think this might be Piri for you. The question is someone with the Lynch syndrome gene automatically considered at high risk for pancreatic cancer, or do other factors need to be present?
I believe that depends upon the gene, and that data is changing all the time. So I think if you go to the Force website, you can see which Lynch syndrome genes are associated with increased risk of pancreatic cancer. And there are estimates of what that increased risk is compared to the general population risk. Unfortunately, I don't know it off the top of my head. Andrea is on the call. Maybe she does. Yeah, maybe she can't talk.
Oh,
Hi, yes. Thanks for the question. If you're able to clarify which gene, I can share the link.
the question is about someone with the Lynch syndrome gene, if they're automatically considered at high risk for pancreatic cancer, or do other factors need to be present?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's why we were
five.
clarifying. There's 5 different genes that cause Lynch syndrome, and each
sorry.
one has a slightly different risk profile. Again, Piri's advice to go to the website for the specific gene is a great one, but we'd be happy to help this individual if possible.
Just came in, MSH6 is the specific gene. I don't. Perhaps we'll just follow the link to the Force website for additional information. And I'm going to move on to one of our last questions. This one also is for Piri. It's if I have an inherited mutation in BRCA1 or BRCA2 and have been diagnosed with ovarian cancer, why is my risk for breast cancer now so low?
The study that I described didn't really look at that, what factors were contributing to lower risk. But the authors suggested a few factors. And if you think about it, most ovarian cancer patients are treated with chemotherapy. And chemotherapy is systemic, so that goes throughout the body. And if there are, early cells that are transforming into breast cancer cells and you get systemic chemotherapy, those cells may be killed at that time. Also, with the advent of PARP inhibitors, another targeted drug that targets PARP particularly well in patients with BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutations. So a lot of times now, ovarian cancer patients will be given a PARP inhibitor, often as maintenance therapy after an ovarian cancer diagnosis. So being on these types of therapies may be one reason that the breast cancer risk is lowered. Also, people with ovarian cancer are going to have surgery, and that surgery will remove their ovaries and their fallopian tubes, which we know reduces breast cancer risk in women with BRCA1 and 2 mutations, basically taking the source of estrogen or most estrogen out of the body. So again, this study wasn't designed to answer those questions specifically, but I think, those are some pretty good, reasonable conclusions about why your breast cancer risk goes way down after you've been diagnosed with ovarian cancer.
Well, thank you, Piri. And thanks again to our 4 speakers. Really appreciate that. We have our upcoming live webinars. You can click the QR code here. Ask the Experts will be coming up shortly. Encourage you to click the link for additional information. And please share your feedback. We've dropped a link to the survey in the chat, as well as the opportunity to click this QR code to take the survey. Your feedback is invaluable in helping us improve future events and help us shape future programming. At this time, we'd like to thank our sponsors again for helping to bring this program to you. Please continue to reach out to Force for your support and information needs. While there are many mutations and many cancers, there's just one community, the Force community, that supports anyone who is impacted by them. Thank you very much for attending. Have a good day, everyone.